Hi everyone, this is Ralph Deal from Tuscola United Church of Christ, and this is the second Sunday of Easter, and I want to first of all introduce you to our cat, Cheddar. Cheddar is a cat that we got back in December, and anyway, as you can see, he's a feisty cat. He's in kind of a wild state right now, running around and stuff. But anyway, all of you have wanted to have a close-up of him, and so here he is. And as you can see, he's not too excited about this video. All right, thank you. Okay, on this Sunday, I want to focus on a passage in the Gospel of Luke. It's the famous passage on these two men who, after Jesus was crucified, they walked to the Emmaus road. And the thing about this passage is not only is it a great post-Easter passage, in which it involves the risen Christ and his encounter with two people. But there's also a passage that is famous, and as a matter of fact, when I was growing up, when first became a Christian, I went to the home of Reverend Fred and Sophie Lemmert. They were the ones who influenced my life so much from the beginning. And actually, when I went to seminary, they were both like the cooks. They took care of the maintenance and the cooking for the students. And so it was neat to hear the pastor that I came to Christ under is also the one who was in seminary helping out that way. And the thing I remember is when I went to their home, they had this beautiful picture of the Emmaus Road scene, where the two men were walking down the road, and the risen Christ was with them. It was just a beautiful picture. And I remember it also, they had a light that they could turn on, and it made the whole thing beautiful. Well, let me just read a passage from Luke 24, 13 through 35, and I'm just going to read some excerpts from it. Now on that day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, and about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near, and he went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" And they stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" And he asked them, "What things?" And they replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified." And so anyway, they were talking to this stranger. They didn't know who he was. And he began to tell them, he says, "Well, don't you know that the Old Testament had all kinds of passages about the Messiah, and that he had to suffer and he had to die?" And then as they got closer to the town of Emmaus, then this happened. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is now almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. But when he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. And they said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and they returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road, and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. Well, late Friday afternoon, he died, and then there was Saturday, which should have been the worst day. They could not forget what they saw. Did you ever look directly at the sun And then afterwards you close your eyes and you can still see the sun in your eyelids. The sun's outline and image is still there. So it must have been like that for the ones who actually witnessed the crucified Christ. I mean, imagine, they saw the three crosses, they heard the words, and as they closed their eyes, they could still see the three crosses, even though their eyes were closed. And even though their ears were, they may even have put fingers in their ears, they could still hear the sounds that made up the cry of the Jesus crying for thirst, crying with a loud voice, saying, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And then he took his last breath and he died. So what do you do after something like that happens? The poet was right when he said, after great pain comes a formal feeling. One goes through the emotions, you know. Life goes back to reality. The bills still come in, whether it's the water bill or the power bill or the cell phone bill. Life just goes on. Bills keep arriving. And people are very polite after, you know, a crisis like that. And they will talk to you, but usually not about what really matters. They'll talk to you about the weather and about other people and stuff like that. And perhaps the worst thing of all is that it's when we realize that life is just going to have to go on just the way it is, and as it always has gone on, except for one thing. Life will never be the same again. So at least for some of the followers of Jesus, the worst day was the third one, which would have been for us our Monday. This brings us to the story portrayed in Luke 24. These two persons trudging their way on the road to Emmaus. They know about the crucifixion, and they were afraid that his whole life had been just nothing. It had ended in tragedy. And so these followers, disappointed, disillusioned, heartbroken. I mean, what else do you do? What else was there to do on a Sunday except go to Emmaus, to get out of town? And where do they go? Well, they go to Emmaus. Their hopes dashed, they carry on their backs the crushing burden of defeat and dejection. And where is Emmaus? Well, I mean, it's no particular place really. It wasn't very famous at all. And the only reason they went there was that it was 7 miles from a situation that had become unbearable. They wanted to get away. Do you understand what I mean when I say that we all, on occasion, have gone to Emmaus? Emmaus can be a drive just to see a few wind turbines out in some remote area. Or it can be a walk in the park just for the sake of getting out of the house and going out, getting outdoors. Emmaus is the place we go when life saddens us, when our dreams have been shattered like a piece of china dropped from the second floor. It could be going to the lake fishing or playing on the PlayStation. Whatever, wherever you can get away from it all. And oftentimes it is a place where there is silence, where you can attempt to forget that the world can be harsh. Even the best and the worst die. Well, Emmaus is where these two men go, or these two people. We don't really know if they're both men. They try to forget about Jesus. He's dead, he's gone, it's all over with now. They've killed him, and without him, we are nothing. So we followed him. We thought he was the one that was going to save us, but it just didn't turn out. Now that's the picture of disillusionment. Of course, we know the rest of the story. We know how the resurrected Lord came up to them and followed them and walked with them, and they eventually too, not only did they encounter the risen Christ, but they too were resurrected and given new life and new hope, and they eventually experienced that. C.S. Lewis wrote a little book called A Grief Observed. Perhaps you know about C.S. Lewis. He was a famous Christian writer. He wrote the Chronicles of Narnia. He wrote the Screwtape Letters, Surprised by Joy, and of course, the famous book that he wrote was called Mere Christianity. He was a bachelor most of his life. He was well into his 50s before he married another person. He married a woman who was also a late adult convert to the Christian faith. Her name was Miss Joy Davidman. She herself was a very respected author. They were so happy in their marriage and in their faith together. However, a very short time after they were married, Joy Davidman discovered that she had cancer. Matter of fact, they had declared that it was terminal. And therefore, C.S. Lewis had the awful experience of watching before his own eyes the slow, horrible, and painful death of his beloved wife of so short a time. It was very traumatic for him. And so, a few days after the funeral, he began to write down some of his thoughts, his honest thoughts about his grief experience. And what he wrote, he later published in a little volume called A Grief Observed. He published it under another name, though, under N.W. Clerk. And because some of the material was so frustrating and harsh, he hid his own name from it. But after his death in 1963, it was republished under his name. And in this little book, Lewis expressed, in the early pages, he says some things about God and about the faith that would make you cringe when you read them. Listen to his words, but remember that he's saying these things out of a broken heart. He says, her absence is like the sky, spread over everything. I not only live each day in grief, but I live each day thinking about living each day in grief. And he says an odd byproduct of my loss is that I'm aware of being an embarrassment to everyone I meet. At work, in the street, I see people as they approach me trying to make up their minds whether they'll say something about it or not. And I hate it if they do, but I also hate it if they don't. And perhaps the bereaved ought to be isolated, he said, in a special settlement like lepers. And then he goes on and he says a little later, meanwhile, he says, where's God? This is one of the most disquieting symptoms. A door slammed in your face and sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. After that, there's silence. You may as well turn away. And then he prays, oh God, why did you take such trouble to force this creature out of its shell if it is now doomed to crawl back, to be sucked back into it? However, as the pages unfold, Lewis begins to move deeper and deeper into an examination of his problem in this whole experience. He finally came to the conclusion. He says the problem had not been his experience with God, but rather his problem had been with his expectations. You see, our problem is that we tend to box God into acting one way or another, usually our way, the way we want him to act, the way we want things to turn out. And then, if that doesn't happen, we get discouraged, and then, well, we take the road to Emmaus. We do everything we can to escape the thought. But the crucial thing to remember is that there's not just one form of God's help that applies to every situation. God does not act in just one way. His being very present in a time of trouble it comes in a number of ways. For one thing, God's help may come in the form of rescue. God works for us. Or God's help may come in the form of collaboration. That is, God works with us or through us. Or God's help may come in the form of inward change, where in that case, God works in us. Well, first of all, God's help may come in the form of a rescue. That is God working for us. There's power outside of ourselves, breaking in and saving us, rescuing us from a difficult situation. I mean, there are many biblical illustrations of this. Remember in Mark's Gospel, the leper who comes running up to Jesus and he cries for help and he says, Lord, Lord, I have a problem. I am a leper. I have a terrible disease and there's nothing, and my body is rotting away. I ache physically. I am alienated socially. Lord, please save me and heal me. I mean, here's the classic story of helplessness, where a person needs outside help. And the only thing that they can get is that outside help to rescue them. He needs rescue in the story, and of course, you know the story is that the great physician, Jesus, heals this leper, and then he is able to go back into society, go back to his family, and live a normal life. Now, I think that's what happens when we want to be saved out of it. We want to be delivered. I mean, there's nothing to be ashamed of. Even Jesus did it in the Garden of Gethsemane. He said, Father, if it be possible, remove this cup of suffering from me. Deliver me. But nevertheless, your will be done. So in some ways, that's how we define grace. God's love comes to save us and rescue us. So it's okay to call for help. And sometimes God's help comes in the form of that, unconditional love and grace from outside of ourselves into us to help us and rescue us from our situations. But there's also another form of God's help, and that's called collaboration. This is where God works with us and through us. There's a story of the man who comes to church and he prays for his friend who is in trouble. And the man prays, help him, Lord. Touch him, Lord. If you just touch him with your finger, please, Lord, touch him. And then deep within the soul, the man hears the voice of God answering, you touch him. You are my finger. You are the one who can make a difference in his life. Well, that is collaboration. God uses us to do his work. Remember the story about the beginning skier who accidentally got on the wrong hill? It was the slope for the expert skiers, and he had no business being on that hill. So he started down that deep, deep slope, and then he got scared, and he lost control and flew up into the air, and somehow he grabbed onto a tree limb. And he had lost control. And so, holding on for his dear life, he cried out loud, is there anybody up there who can help me? Is there anybody there who can rescue me? Please. Is there anybody up there? And then all of a sudden he hears a voice, and the Lord says to him, yes, I'm up here, and I'm with you, and here's what I want you to do. Let go of that tree limb, get on your skis, and ski to the bottom of the mountain. Trust me, I will be with you. And the man said, is there anybody else up there? Well, isn't that what we do? We have the opportunity to collaborate with God, but we don't quite trust him. And we say we don't have the resources to handle the crisis. But remember, God takes what we have and makes it enough. We are co-laborers with God to get his work done in this world. So, another way in which God can help us is by working to change us from the inside. Inward change. I mean, sometimes God works within us. There are some circumstances and situations in life that simply cannot be changed. I mean, we're living in one of those right now. All we can do is deal with the coronavirus by accepting that it is a reality that we need to deal with. There is that serenity of acceptance that we need to just simply deal with what's there. Well, do you remember Paul, the apostle? And he had this thorn in the flesh. What was it? Well, scholars argue about what it was. Some think it was just ill health, maybe epilepsy. Some scholars even suggest that it was a nagging woman. My own guess was that it was his eyesight. You will recall that when he wrote to the Galatians, he said, "You were so sympathetic to me that you would even have plucked out your own eyes and given them to me." Perhaps he had problems seeing very well. And here, some of the people in Galatia even said, "We would be glad to donate our eyes and give them to you." And in that same letter, he said, "Look at how big the letters are. I have written them with my own hands." Well, the point is that whatever Paul's thorn in the flesh was, he never got over it. It was a hindrance to his work. And what did he do? He prayed for rescue. And then he tried to use the best resources of the day to collaborate a solution. But nothing worked. Ultimately, it became clear to Paul that this is a circumstance that I've got to learn to live with. It's not going to change. It will not be changed outwardly, so I have to change inwardly. And he did. And later Paul said, "I have learned whatever state I am to be content. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." In today's story in Luke 24, God helped these two men on the road to Emmaus to see Jesus in the breaking of the bread. He changed them from the inside. And as a result, they gained a new perspective on life. Their eyes were open, and they realized that Christ was alive, that he was the risen Lord. And they were renewed and energized, and they went to the disciples, and they excitedly told them their vision. And it literally, you could see that they were a changed people. They changed internally. They changed the way they looked at the world. They were changed within, and now they were working with God to change the world around them. God didn't rescue them out of their disillusionment. And through Jesus revealing himself, he gave them confidence and courage, and they were able to then go forward in life. Sometimes this help comes in the form of rescue. Sometimes God's help comes in the form of collaboration. Sometimes his help comes in the form of inward change. But here's the good news. The good news is that his help does come. You can be assured that if you seek it, that he will come in some form to aid you in your life and to spur you forward. Well, thank you for listening, and that passage, I hope that you'll take a deeper look at it. That is a great story about the risen Christ changing people's lives. And he can change our lives too. Thank you. God bless you. Amen.